How about the first one from Wonder and Wrath, which is titled Heirloom?
Yeah. Heirloom. I know that I was suckered in. Firm curves bulging, olive skin, perfectly well-rounded cheeks, rubified with port wine streaks, the saffron crown with one deep crack, an eggplant-colored knob and back, a touch of tumor. It would still be sunning on my windowsill, art illustrating daily life, except I took my carving knife and slowly sliced 5 slabs of fresh, soil-sweet, yet vaguely bitter flesh. That's obviously my tomato poem.
Right.
But
every poet has to write one.
It's a classic of the genre.
Yeah.
But it's a poem I don't think I would have written when I was first 10 years I was starting out. And I think I'm taking more joy in daily things, noticing daily things. I think I was always doing some of that, but I think I do that more. And I think I've got a deeper sense of how the world damages and changes the things it should be celebrating. When we think about tomatoes, particularly, what I grew up eating in the 60s and 70s, and, sort of tasteless, plasticky, vaguely pink kind of thing. They're not that big on tomatoes. But, you get an heirloom tomato, fresh, and the feel, the colors, the flavors. I mean, it's just something that we should be reminded that we need to savor those types of things, and that's really why I wrote the poems.
Now, your poems are very musical in general, something that I appreciate as a musician myself. It's something that always the element of poetry that I'm the most tuned into. I'm not always great with subtext, but the musicality of it I get. There's a kind of course, you're good with forms and things like that, but there's also sort of like an internal musicality to it with, some of the alliteration and the last slowly sliced 5 slabs of fresh, soil sweet yet vaguely bitter flesh, and just it also feels very natural within the forms and the meters. So I just wanted to ask a little bit about your practice, or your how you obviously you have an innate talent, but how did you develop that musicality in your writing?
Well, it took a long time. It doesn't come naturally, so it's a lot of practice. It's a lot of reading. One of the things that shocks me about a lot of MFA programs is they don't think a lot of reading, particularly, from more musical works, is necessary, and that's a shame. And I think if you go back and look at the first book, I think there's some very good poems in it. But there's also an undercurrent of proving I can do this, sort of showing that, I kind of belong, in the field. And so they tend to be very, very regular in terms of their form. I think in terms of the content, they're often unpredictable, because that's something that people have been saying about my stuff pretty much from the beginning. In the same way that the tomato poem is, kind of throwing you a curveball right at the beginning, make you think you're reading something a little bit more sensual than just a tomato. But I think as I've progressed and I've kept doing it, I've had much more interest in pushing the boundaries a little bit, trying to find new music, and I've become a lot more confident when I'm experimenting about what I think works and what doesn't. But it took a long time to get there. And there's a lot more experimentation in Wonder and Wrath, a lot more use of internal rhyme, alliteration in certain places. And then there, the line from which the title of the book comes from is in an alliterative poem. And I think I've just started sketching out in my own mind what the next book of original poetry is probably going to look like. And I think it's going to be, it's still going to be very formal. I mean, I'm not one of those, I'm not going to go Donald Hall on people and embrace form early and then abandon it for modernism, because that's not going to happen with me. But in some of the newer poems, I'm experimenting in different ways, writing some very different kinds of poems, and I think that's good. And and part of it is just progressing. Part of it is different stages of life. I've got the luxury now that I can work full time on my poetry, and I work very hard at it. It's producing some things that are often even surprising. To me, it is an amazing thing when you have a poem that's taken shape for the first time, and you look at it and say, "Where the heck did that come from?" And that happens to me from time to time. And those are often the better ones. The ones where you start off and you have a relatively clear idea of how you want it to start and how you want it to finish. Those often don't work as well. You have to put a lot of those on the bone pile. It's the ones that take you by surprise a lot of the times that really are the keepers.
Well, Plato, in one of his dialogues, I forget which one, Socrates says something about how he's not really interested in, reading the poems by people who are completely sane and in control, and he wants the divine madness. So I think
I'll take that as a compliment.
There's always been that wisdom, pre-Christian even, of acknowledging something of divine inspiration and something that we're not totally in control of. So yes, I agree. The poet has to be vulnerable to being surprised by what comes out of him.
Yeah.
And some of that is also too just the way that our influences combine in unpredictable ways as well.
Well, at least from my vantage point, too, the world has become a lot more unpredictable. I mean, I think when I was growing up, there was a lot of turbulence and uncertainty about the world. And, I obviously absorbed some of that. But I think, getting into the 80s and 90s, I think that I had a lot more sense that it ultimately was a rational world and we were making progress. Unfortunately, I've lost that sense. And it does mean that what I'm writing is, to me anyway, a lot more unpredictable than it was when I first started out.
One of the poems that's more explicitly religious is An Apostle Falls.
An Apostle Falls. Betrayal had fulfilled the prophecy. Too proud for penance and too weak to run, he strung himself up from a cedar tree and swayed for days beneath a scathing sun. Thieves cut his desiccated body free, then left it in the dust. Throughout that night, Jerusalem kept shuddering with light.
Yeah, that's a great. I love that last image. I think.
Yeah, and that's the one that you look at and you say, well, where did that come from? The rest of the time I was thinking about Judas, and the first 6 lines, they're from the left side of the brain, and then all of a sudden, I'm playing with the language, I'm looking at, and this line just seems to appear, and the logical part of your brain usually starts to fight, those sorts of intrusions. But you have to take those seriously. You look at them. The more I looked at it, I said, I'm not sure even why this works as well as it does, but I think it does work. And for me, it was a very startling image that somehow just captured what I needed to say.